hopeful.
What truly matters
The country's recent
is
vote
not
to
which
leave
party
the EU.
controls our government.
Hello everyone and welcome to the presentation of the Global RepTrak 100 for 2018. I'm excited to share with you the most recent results from our global survey of understanding who are the most reputable companies in the world. Welcome to our viewers from around Asia, Europe, Latin America, North America and beyond. Thank you for joining us and welcoming you to today's session. Let me first kick off by telling you a little bit about what I'm going to walk through today. First off, I'd like to just give you a quick overview of what we measured and how we measured it in terms of our methodology, a little bit of context on the global big picture and some of the key learnings and insights that we discovered that are macro issues that impact all companies, digging deeper into understanding the reasons behind what is driving reputation today and how companies can take advantage of it, and then of course the big reveal, who is the #1 most ranked company in the world in 2018? And then maybe digging a little deeper also into some examples of companies of not only where they ranked, but more importantly, what was driving some of their rankings, what was impacting some of their reputational issues that allowed them to either rise or fall versus previous years in 2017. And we'll wrap it all up with some conclusions and implications at the end. Also, I'll be welcoming some contributors from around the world and members of our Reputation Institute team. Brad Heck from our office in the US representing the Americas, and Michele Tesoro-Tess with a point of view representing a European perspective. I'll also be joined by one of our landmark clients here, Mars Inc., who will also be walking you through some early observations on reputation and how it impacts them. So let's get into a quick understanding of the methodology. First off, there are really three components to our surveys. We are calibrating the informed general public's reputation around the world in terms of how they view and evaluate different kinds of companies. And first off is an emotional component, which is what we call the RepTrak Pulse Score. That is in many ways a leading indicator where a company's reputation is going. The second part of what we measure is what we call the sort of cognitive or rational dimensions. In many ways, these are like the reasons to believe that underscore and underpin a company's reputation. Things like products and services, innovation, workplace, governance, citizenship, financial performance and leadership, the things that attribute to how people think and feel about the company and some of the underlying motivations for why they might choose to engage them or not. And then in each of those areas, there are essentially 23 core attributes that we capture. And all those things really add up to an accumulation of an outcome of what we call these sort of supportive behaviors or actions based on what people will then do in terms of what they would attribute to a company's reputation. And including those kinds of measures are things like an individual's willingness to purchase the products and services of those companies. Would they be willing to work for the company? Would they invest in the company? And a couple of new areas that we've added for this year. Would they truly provide conviction and defend the company in a debate? Or under certain sets of circumstances, would they actually avoid or even maybe potentially boycott a company? So really robust measurement system that provides a full 360 of a reputation of an organization, and importantly, the potential to be more successful in the marketplace. So that's our model and how we measure reputation. Let's take a few minutes just to understand what markets we measured in. Essentially, we measured reputation across 15 key countries around the world, including markets from Latin America, North America, Asia, and Europe, essentially translating to about 65 to 70% of global gross domestic product. So really significant leading economies around the world. And we really dove very deep into understanding what the individuals of those countries thought about different organizations and companies. In essence, in totality, we talked to just over 230,000 individuals and understanding how they thought about 140 different companies. And the survey was in the field during a very critical time period, essentially from January to February of 2018. So this is literally fresh out the field and in essence represents the largest normative database on corporate reputation in the world. So let's get going by setting the scene. Let's understand What's going on in the world of reputation? How can we begin to make sense of all that's occurred in the world in the past 12 months? First off, we must recognize that the world is at a strategic inflection point. We've had certain events in the past 12 months that have really started to change dramatically the global complexion of companies and their ability to better manage their reputation. We've had the election of Donald Trump in North America. We've had Brexit in UK. We've had Catalonia unrest in Spain. We've had the growing might of Russia expressed through different means and channels. We've had records on Wall Street. We've had the emergence of the Me Too movement, corporate tax reforms, many things that truly as intangibles have impacted the reputation of companies and essentially underscore both the political, social and economic change that's inherent in the world today. The real impact of how reputation is playing out, not only is it seen to be driving the economy, but increasingly some of these underlying factors in essence are impacting the companies and the way that people view them. So what does it really add up to? And based on our data, a critical observation. We believe, based on what we're seeing in the data, that for the first time since the Great Recession, we've actually seen a decline in reputation scores. In fact, I think it's fair to say that the reputation bubble has burst. Compared to 2017, we actually see a decline in the overall pulse score of all companies measured across the countries around the world that represents about a 1.4 pulse point decline in overall reputation. That is truly a significant decline and not something we've seen in our data since essentially prior to 2011. Here's a quick overview, and let's sort of look a little more deeply into the data. So we're backtracking here through 2000 and essentially 13, and we're looking at the sort of incline in reputation year after year from that time period through 2017. This reflected the growing rise in the stock market around the world, the growing rise in consumer confidence, and the growing recovery post the Great Recession. And you can see relative to 2018, there's a precipitous decline beginning to emerge. We see a decline of 1.4 pulse points. That is really, from a statistical standpoint, something we really need to be paying attention to. But it's not just the reputation decline that we're seeing across all companies globally. We're also seeing a decline in the resultant support that companies can earn. From a standpoint of whether people would buy your products and services, invest in your company, work for it, give you the benefit of the doubt as a very important metric, or even trust you to do the right thing, we're seeing some major declines across the board, which really represents growing trouble for companies around the world and their ability to be more successful in managing their business. And really, in this particular case, the decline in reputation is potentially a harbinger for more difficult times ahead. And here's just some of the things we're beginning to see in the data. First off, there's a potential indication of more trading volatility and more headwinds that might be impacting the stock market and the way that companies are valued. According to our data, we saw an 8.1 percentage point decline in the willingness to invest behind any given company. That would suggest that there's a lower inclination of putting money into the markets and would potentially make it tougher for companies and businesses to attract new investors. Secondly, more than we've seen in a long while, it's probably going to be harder to attract the best talent around the world, especially millennials who judge the companies based on their values and not just the products and services the company makes. We're seeing it's going to become more difficult for any organization to become a so-called employer of choice. In other words, perceptions of workplace have been impacted by some of the recent changes, and we saw a 6.1 percentage point decline in the willingness to work for globally, again, for any given company. One of the other things we saw in the data that was especially interesting was that it's harder than ever before to attract people to want to purchase your products and essentially to become more loyal. We saw a downward trend in the overall purchase intent of 7.9 percentage points on the metric of willingness to purchase, essentially signaling the fact it's going to be more difficult to actually create loyalty and engender long-term commitment for any given organization. In fact, it might be a suggestion that members of the general public are more likely to shop around between the companies they choose to do business with. But critically, what this really adds up to is a crisis of trust in society today. So in the court of public opinion and the way that companies are being viewed today, in many ways the jury is out. It's because members of the general public are less likely to trust companies. In essence, what we saw is a decline in the metric of trust the company to do the right thing, which is now hovering at around 38.5 percentage points. That's almost 2 out of 3 people. Put differently, who don't essentially have undying trust in companies that they do business with. So that clearly is a cause for concern. But in addition to that, what it really boils down to is the increased potential for companies to now want to win back the trust that might have eroded in the past 12 months. Today, versus 1 year ago, companies, both big and small, are less likely than ever before to be trusted to do the right thing, especially when no one else is looking. And that translates to a decline in the measure of benefit of the doubt. Today, as it stands, only 30.9% of people globally give any company the benefit of the doubt. And that clearly is a critical metric that organizations want to turn around. But it's not all doom and gloom. From a positive standpoint, what really has transpired in the past 12 months is this decline in trust has led for a decrease in the number of promoters. Versus 1 year ago, we actually see a decline in the number of promoters, but actually an increase in the number of so-called fence sitters. These are people who are either neutral or I'm not sure about any given company. And essentially, we see about 51% of the world today is still open to being convinced otherwise that a company has a strong reputation and should be worth the while of their attention. So put another way, it's not that we've seen a negative erosion in terms of overall sentiment. It's just that fewer people are more positive and increasingly more people are more neutral. And of course, from a corporate communication standpoint, that presents opportunity. These people are still open to being convinced. And as we look at the potential and the upside of turning these so-called fence sitters, the neutrals and I don't knows in society today, is it could yield significant increases in reputation. Amongst those people who are fence sitters, they typically rate a company with an average reputation of 68.2 pulse points. But transferring or translating that fence sitter from a mindset of being neutral to positive, in essence to becoming a promoter with conviction, the upside could be significant. It could go up as high as 85.4 pulse points. That would represent a 17.2 pulse point increase on the potential to drive high levels of reputation, but ultimately could translate to deeper levels of behavior. So in many ways, this is the challenge ahead for many more companies. How can you turn the fence sitters, the people neutral or not sure about what you stand for, and convert them into fence sitters? And fundamentally, the opportunity to do that, in a way, begins and ends with the potential to drive high levels of familiarity. But not just knowing the company's name and the fact it's been in business for a long while, but actually really driving what we call depth of understanding so that people can highly relate to the company and what it stands for. In fact, those companies who are able to do this, between those who have a low level of familiarity versus a high level of familiarity, can also increase and translate to about a 12.6 pulse point lift, I should say, in the potential to drive increased reputation. So there is a big difference between those people who just know you and have a good sense of what you are. It could be truly a significant increase in success. So let's drill down and really dig deep. Let's understand, what does it take to truly win in reputation today, and how can you potentially outplay the competition? I'm going to identify 5 key trends for you to contemplate. First off, it's an increased focus on products and enterprise. In other words, making the link between the things you sell and what you stand for. And what we found in looking at a factor-adjusted regression are essentially the 3 dimensions that matter the most. In fact, it attributes to about 51% of reputation that can be identified with the relative importance of products and services, citizenship and governance. In fact, those are the things that matter the most in your ability to have reputational impact in the marketplace. What's interesting is when you combine those 3 things together and correlate it with the potential to predict reputation, you see a very high likelihood of driving reputation change. In fact, the R-squared is about a 0.65, which essentially says it's quite predictive in your ability to measure the impact of reputation change and to identify with the meaningful factors of governance, citizenship, and products combined with your ability to yield more success in the marketplace. And when you really drill deeper and now dissect those 3 dimensions and really get into the nuances of the data, what you can actually essentially identify with is ethics, fairness, and social influence are especially key. And let me sort of play this out for you, and let's sort of look at this in a chart in a bit more detail. So sort of going from top to bottom, we're essentially looking at the relative weight of importance of all the 23 attributes we measure. And then going from left to right, we're looking at the essential average reputation score for all the companies that we've identified. Things that appear in the top right are, of course, the things that you want to continue doing well. Things like high quality products and services, meeting customers' needs, things that align with measures and perceptions of product assurance that are critically important to continue business success. The things in the bottom right-hand quadrant are things that are perhaps what a company does quite well on in terms of reputation scores, but aren't, relatively speaking, as important. Now, things like profitability, as an example, are increasing in terms of measures and the way the company is viewed, but unto itself is not contributing to increasing reputation. In fact, you could argue in some ways, the more profitable you are as a company, the higher expectations that you create for ethics, fairness, and social influence, and the more you set yourself up for potentially falling short, because what the data also suggests, which is what appears in the top left-hand quadrant, is that those are the three most important attributes to both drive reputation change today, but potentially to drive reputation success in the future. So on a relative measure, tapping into measures of positive influence on society, measures of ethical behavior, things that promote and propagate fairness, those are the trigger points that, if messaged correctly, could actually help you enhance your reputation and move the agenda forward. So it's really interesting to see how beyond products and services, those three things could become the new trigger points that could drive enhanced reputation change, and of course, importantly, give you the opportunity to outplay the competition. The second key trend we've identified is the potential for a company to be viewed as purposefully genuine. What that means is they don't just talk about their purpose, they essentially live it. What we found as part of our analysis is a strong correlation between measures of brand strength and how it pays out in terms of overall reputation. In fact, if we look at the top 10 companies, they have measures of strong brand strength because they are highly purposeful, and that unto itself yields an elevated reputation. In fact, as purpose has become more important, your typical company is actually taking a backward step in terms of brand strength, which unto itself is an irony, given that purpose-driven companies are the ones that are most successful, yet many companies aren't viewed that way. And in fact, we've also found in our data what we call a genuine disconnect, which is really the difference between a company's ability to both be authentically and genuinely engaged, both from a communication standpoint, but also from a brand delivery experience. In the past 12 months, we can see that companies who have a more authentic, more genuine, more straightforward manner in terms of how they tell their stories are the ones that are most successful. In fact, you can engender about a 4.4 pulse point lift by increasing the merits of genuine form of persona and brand impressions. The third trend we've identified aligns with corporate communications and the potential for any company to overcome what is the so-called white noise in your ability to kind of break through. To talk in more detail about this topic, I'd like to introduce you to Michele Tesoro-Tess. He's a Senior Managing Director of our business in Europe. He's going to walk you through some key insights and understanding of what are the opportunities and how you can overcome the challenges of white noise.
Thank you, Stephen. One of the key aspects that companies need to take care when focusing on building their reputation is the actual channel impact and the reach they have in consumers out there. If we look at the results of channels in 2018 versus 2017, what we're seeing is a decrease in reach and a decrease in impact in all four categories of channels. What we have in front is a quad that is actually showcasing the reach, so the penetration of these channels across consumers on the x-axis, and we've got the impact these same channels have on the reputation. The only channel that is decreasing in terms of impact but remaining the same when it comes to reach is actually direct experience. And the interesting area is about earned media. Earned media stays the same in terms of impact. There's approximately 3 points reputation uplift from those companies who are actually investing in that channel, but the reach is going down. Now, there's a couple of points that I think is worth mentioning when we're seeing the decline in terms of reach. It looks as though consumers, and that is the trend we're seeing, actually take less interest in looking at what companies are actually sending through these channels. It appears they are actually more inclined to talk with people and make their mind up based on things that they're hearing from friends rather than things that companies are actually disseminating. The earned media aspect is one of the focus things, and we know very well the importance and rise of social media and how much this is a key channel for companies today. In fact, one of the things we've looked at in its 2018 Global 100 study is how social media conversations have had an impact in terms of building equity. If you look at the impact on specific social media channels, there's a relatively small percentage of people that actually see that impact. There's an uplift of 2 points on social media specifically. 4 are the key channels we've looked at. We've looked at companies' advertisements on social media. We've looked at social media postings by company, topic experts, websites and blogs done by them, and other postings about the company on these channels. The reach is approximately the same, so we're seeing approximately a 10% reach on these, and the impact is just about 2 points. Now, specifically, if we look at the RepTrak methodology, it is very important for companies to understand what is driving social media discussion. And one of the analyses we've done is we've taken, for the top 10 companies in the rankings, which you're going to see in a little while, we're looking at across the 7 dimensions, so from products and services to innovation, talking about product, to the social role company plays, talking about workplace governance and citizenship, and into more the performance element of how a company is actually performing on the market on leadership and performance. Well, if we look at the distribution, the most prevalent dimensions on which social media is actually investing on and talking about, we're talking about products and services innovation and governance and citizenship, which is actually very good because those are the key drivers that will actually impact the reputation of a company. Now, what is the trend we're seeing if we think about the top 10 companies and how they are transferred on social media channels? We're seeing an overwhelming positive sentiment on the top 10 companies on these dimensions, which basically showcases that these companies are actually gaining reputation equity. So, of course, one of the key findings from here is if you're not active on social media and you don't have a dedicated effort with influencers, that's a key area that you need to invest on. One of the key things that we have found by looking at this is companies who are investing with influencers as a core strategy, like these top 10 companies, they are much more purpose-led than product-oriented. Now, I'm going to share with you some key examples about each of these dimensions just to showcase what it means. When we talk about products and services, the conversations about the top 10 companies are not only about the high quality and value of the products they sell, but there's a lot about the customer service that these companies are giving. If we're looking at innovation, innovation is, of course, a very, very product-oriented and product launch characteristic. The way in which social media is talking about these top 10 companies, it's not only about the latest product they've sold, but it's about how innovation can save and improve their lives. Going into citizenship, we very well know that the whole role that companies play in society is a key driver of reputation nowadays. The way in which social media conversations talk about these top 10 companies when it comes to citizenship, it's more about how the company can actually help you live a better life and how you can contribute actually to making it sustainable. When it comes to governance, it's all about being genuine and transparent and being very, very clearly oriented in terms of the purpose that the company engages with. And in these 2 dimensions, the weight is very important. These 2 dimensions account for approximately 30% of the total conversations about these top 10 companies. So it gives you a sense that a third of the whole conversations that are reported on the top 10 companies are about governance and citizenship. Question is, it goes back to you, all of you companies out there who are engaging on all these 7 key aspects of reputation, are you actually posing the right amount of focus on these social related aspects?
Thank you, Michele. Great comment. Really appreciate it. The 4th trend we've identified is understanding the impact of millennials. Millennials obviously represent a significant cohort. They're about almost a third of the world's population and certainly a segment of the global stakeholder opportunity that many companies need to take seriously. Millennials unto themselves can drive incremental reputation lift. In studying the data, we found that the top 10 companies in reputation around the world are the ones that do disproportionately well on their ability to engender support for millennials relative to non-millennials. In fact, there's a delta of 1.3 pulse points between the pulse score that a typical company gets in the top 10 on the merits of millennials versus non-millennials. And that gap has only grown over time. And we've seen an increase from 2016 in our data that says the companies who engage more millennials are the ones that are going to be more successful. But what was interesting about the data is not only are millennials important, but especially female millennials. In fact, we found with the emergence of the Me Too movement and the growing shift towards female empowerment that targeting and identifying with female millennials could actually yield incremental benefits. We've looked at our data and found that typically your average female millennial has a lower emotional connection to any typical company versus your male counterparts. This is especially true even in the top 10 companies that we've measured, where there's a whole single pulse point difference between the pulse score attributed to female millennials relative to male millennials. So I think that unto itself would represent an interesting strategic opportunity, especially because what drives elevated levels of emotional connection amongst female millennials are really against those three things that matter: the products and services, the governance, and the measures of citizenship, and how the company essentially is working towards making the world a better place to live. And the final and fifth trend we've identified aligns with the potential to truly unleash the voice of a leader. This is interesting because we're seeing the emergence of a new era of leadership, almost as if there's a CEO with a conscience who's really established themselves in the realm of today's society. In fact, any CEO today who can demonstrate they think beyond the profits and the stakeholder interests are really going to drive more emotional empathy with the stakeholders that matter, and importantly would align the leadership credential with the measures of ethics and governance and citizenship and positive influence on society that we've identified as being critical. In fact, we've identified across the top 100 companies we measured that around 66 have strong measures of leadership overall, but very few of them actually deliver on the agenda of governance and citizenship. And as was paraphrased a few years ago by the Harvard Business Review article that essentially said that businesses today can no longer avoid being political. So in other words, you have to take a position, you have to take a stand, you can no longer be on the sidelines around things that impact society. And increasingly the expectation is for companies to become embroiled on the things that really drive societal change. An example of that is our ability to employ a new capability we have that we call CEO RepTrak. And what we're seeing through the lens of that data is the emergence of what we call a CEO activism. In other words, CEOs who not only take a position, but have a vocal point of view in linking their merits of good leadership with social and societal contributions, and especially demonstrate examples of ethical behavior and transparent governance. You can see here in the slide the significant delta that exists between the reputation of the RepTrak 100 companies when there's familiarity with the CEO. In other words, what we're seeing here is there's a lift with those people who are not only familiar with the CEO, but can attribute the CEO's credentials with citizenship, governance, and leadership. And you can see the overall pulse score is up around 5 points, and the merits of citizenship, governance, and leadership all yield significant lift when there's an increased level of familiarity with the CEO and how it ties back to the agenda of the entire organization. So with an understanding of the big picture and the opportunities to win, and some of the overall trends and insights, now let's reveal exactly what you've been waiting for. We're about to reveal the Global RepTrak 100 in 2018 and help you understand who is the most reputable company in the world. And here are the rankings. What I can declare at this point is Rolex has the highest ranking and is viewed as the most reputable company in the world for the third year in a row. It tops out relative to the competitive set, the likes of Lego, Google, Canon, Walt Disney, Sony, Adidas, Bosch, BMW Group, and Microsoft, who are all highly reputable companies, all in the top 10. But Rolex just edges it out. What's interesting to observe is some of the movers and shakers and changes in the top 10. While it's remained relatively stable, we do see Google having jumped, Sony, Adidas of note, and BMW and Microsoft are back into the top 10. They weren't in the top 10 in 2017, so it's interesting to see that they've regained the top 10 spots. We do see a little decline relative to Walt Disney, who went down a few places in the rank. Bosch went down ever so slightly, also in the top 10. And we see a couple of companies like Intel and Rolls-Royce who were in the top 10 last year, but are no longer so. So that you can say they've technically fallen out of the top of the heap. This is the Fall 100. This is available on our website. If you'd like to go to reputationinstitute.com and look at the rankings, you'll be able to see and observe perhaps where your company stacks up. Again, you can see a lot of movement, both up and down relative to the rankings of companies and how they change compared to each other. Certainly very interesting to see which companies made the RT100 this year. And of note, what I like to do is perhaps feature one particular organization, Mars Inc., who is new to the rankings this year and worked there in 2017. In fact, to help us really understand the impact of that, I'd like to introduce you to one of our special guests, Andy Farrow, who's the Vice President and Executive Communications and Strategic Initiatives Leader at Mars Inc. Andy, great to see you today.
It's great to be with you.
So Andy, so you made the top 100. Why is that important to you?
I mean, simply reputation is critical to almost every aspect of our business. It's critical to recruiting talent. It's critical to great relationships in local communities. It's critical to relationships with our customers. And so to get recognition that we are one of the leaders in this field is incredibly powerful.
What did you learn from the data that you thought was especially interesting or even surprising?
I mean, I think we had a hypothesis that familiarity would drive support for Mars, and we knew internally that to know Mars was to love Mars. What the data has shown is that actually plays externally, and that as familiarity increases with Mars, so does our reputation. So I think that's incredibly important. I think that the other thing is that reputation for us isn't an end. It's a means to an end, and sometimes it's a consequence of doing other things. So, for example, when last year we launched our Sustainable Generation Plan, we found that we had the environmental footprint of a country like Panama. Now, we can do lots of great things ourselves that will make a difference to the environmental footprint of Panama. But if you really want to see huge change around climate, around planet, around human rights, around thriving people, then you actually need to build a movement, and you need to get more and more companies to join with you on that charge. And so us telling our story around sustainable generation was about trying to do just that, to get other people along. Now, as a consequence of it, so does our reputation. Improves, which is a good thing. But really, what is the great thing is that you're able to drive positive societal impact.
So as you think about what you've learned, how does that change things? What are some of the opportunities you see for winning in the year ahead?
Well, I mean, I think the first thing is that you know in business that you can manage what you measure. And so having good measurement around our reputation means that we can more effectively manage it. We can look at, where are we doing well? Where there are opportunities from a communications point of view. We can look at what channels work well, what channels work less well, and we can also compare ourselves to the best of breed in terms of reputation and some of our CPG peers. So I think it very much influences our strategy going forward. And then the second thing, it just reinforces that if we go out and tell our story positively, then we will drive reputation, and that will bring the very clear business benefits with it.
Thanks, Andy. Really appreciate your time. Great to have you with us today. So let's go back to looking more deeply into understanding across the top 100 while you continue to peruse the rankings and perhaps where your company stacks up. Let's sort of review a couple of key trends and observations here. So first off, amongst the top 100 companies, the US is the largest percentage of the top 100. In fact, 43% of the companies in the top 100 were from the US, followed by about 12% from Japan and 10% in Germany. So those three countries tended to be dominant in terms of the companies that were represented on the rankings. Of note, for the first time, we actually saw three companies represented from Brazil in the top 100. Natura, Havaianas, and Embraer were there for the first time. Perhaps that's an early indication that perhaps the Brazilian economy is improving. Obviously, time will tell, but it's great to see. Of the companies most prevalent in terms of home country presence, 71% of the US companies saw a drop in the rankings in 2017. In other words, there's a preponderance of US-based companies in the wake of the new administration who actually took a setback in terms of the overall reputation score. So 71% of companies dropped in the rankings from the US. About 50% of companies from Germany also dropped in the rankings and 42% in Japan. So Again, countries of larger economic might saw most downward movement relative to some of the other countries that we studied. And in fact, what was interesting this year is, unlike last year, no company scored in the excellent range, and 58% of companies overall saw a decline in their rankings. 13% saw a decline from relative to the number of organizations who were in the strong range versus last year, and 14% increase in the number of companies who are now average. So in other words, we saw a significant number of companies who moved from what was previously a strong reputation to actually falling back to one that's average. So clearly something going on with the dynamics of companies and corporations overall. But let's sort of take a few moments to sort of focus on some of the high risers and fast fallers. We can note companies like Samsung, Dell, LG Group, Nestle, and Netflix, all of whom had a significant increase in the rankings. In fact, of note, Samsung moved up to 26, actually had a pretty major 44 place jump from where it was last year. And we're going to talk about that in a little moment. It's just interesting, but at the same time, to contrast that with relative to Apple, which actually went down over 38 places in the rankings. Is now only ranked 58 within the top 100. So clearly an interesting paradox to look at. Why did Samsung go up significantly and what was going on with Apple? And if we sort of also look a little deeper into what was going on, we see that some of the consumer packaged goods companies also had some perhaps more challenging years. Johnson & Johnson, obviously impacted by a sort of baby talcum powder cervical cancer allegations and lawsuits. Estee Lauder, AB InBev, all examples of companies who actually were stronger than in the past, but actually have gone down in the past 12 months. So from understanding some of the companies who have been successful and even looking at the industry rankings, now let's take a quick look at some of the differences from around the world. And to help me do that, I'd like to introduce you to another guest. I'd like to introduce you to Brad Hecht. He's our Senior Managing Director for the Americas. Brad, tell us about some things you've seen when you're looking at the data from a global and regional perspective.
Well, thanks, Stephen. And as Stephen said, we're going to do a little bit of a reputation tour around the globe. And we're going to start in this particular slide on the dimension weights. And if there are two words that I would use to describe this particular slide, it's convergence and consolidation. Now, what do I mean by that? If you look at across the 4 different regions, you'll see the number one driver of reputation in all 4 of those regions is products and services. And this is interesting, although not unique, because it's been the case for the past 4 or 5 years. But what is interesting specifically about the products and services attribute is that products and services have increased as a driver of reputation across all 4 of the regions. So again, you're seeing more of a consolidation where products and services are on the rise as a driver of reputation. What is unique is this year, for the very first time, the second most important driver of reputation is consistent across all 4 regions, specifically around the topic of governance. And the big shift is in Latin America from where it was last year, because last year, governance wasn't even in the top 3 most important drivers of reputation in 2017. And you'll see it's vaulted all the way up to number 2, the second most important driver of reputation. So now for the first time, all 4 regions have the second and the first and the second most important drivers of reputation are the same. And just like in the case of products and services, governance has also increased in relative importance across all 4 regions over the past 12 months. You'll also see in 3 out of the 4 regions that corporate citizenship is in the top 3. And in the case of Latin America, financial performance, again, stability of companies is an important driver of reputation there as well. But again, for the first time ever, you'll see the convergence of those 2 most important drivers of reputation, as well as consolidation, increase in importance in those top 2 most important drivers. So let's switch now from a conversation about the weights of reputation, and let's instead now have a conversation about the scores in terms of reputation across the 4 regions. And again, what you're going to see here is a little bit more divergence than we saw in the prior slide, but you're also unfortunately going to see some consistency. So let's start on the far right-hand side with Asia Pacific. If you look at Asia Pacific, you'll see of the 7 different dimensions of reputation, there's only 1 where the average scores across all the different companies we measured is in the strong range, and that's at 70.5, and that's just barely into the strong range. You'll see if you look across the 4 regions that all 4 regions also have scores in the strong range for products and services, which is not a surprise and also good because, as we talked about, the importance of products and services as a driver is increasing. But for the remaining 6 in Asia Pacific, they're all in the average range. If you go to the bottom left and you look at Latin America, you'll see in Latin America, there's a second dimension, and that's performance, that's also in the strong range. You'll see if you go to the left to North America, you'll see that they added a third dimension, also in the strong range, and that's specifically the topic of leadership. And if you go to the top with EMEA, you'll see that there are 4 that are in the strong range. They added innovation. So that's the good news. The big challenge, though, and honestly the big problem that we've been talking about relatively, recently, but also across this entire presentation, is that if you look at the 3 dimensions across all 4 regions that are not in the strong range, in the weak range, those are the CSR dimensions. And there's a perfect representation of the challenge that companies have today. This erosion of trust primarily comes because there's a belief on behalf of stakeholders that companies are not doing what they should and contributing the way they need to around governance, citizenship, and the workplace environment. Not only are all 3 of these in the average range across all 4 regions, but all of them have seen drops in scores across all 4 regions over the past 12 months. Again, that erosion of trust that we were talking about, and it's a pretty significant challenge that needs to be addressed. So if we flip to the next slide now, and we switch away from scores and weights, now we talk about the winners, right? So who are the all-stars across the 4 regions? What you see here is basically the top 5 most reputable companies within each one of the 4 regions. So a total, let's say, of 20 different spots that are available for companies to fill in the top 5. You're going to notice a few things here. The first thing you'll probably notice is that there are only 6 companies total that have a reputation score in the strong range, and 5 of those are in Europe. And the 6th one is Google on the left-hand side in North America with a score of 80.1, barely squeaking into the strong range. If you were to compare this to last year, 2017, more than double the amount of companies in the top 5 list across the 4 regions were in the strong range. So again, that erosion of trust that we've been talking about, now only 6 total in the strong range. If you were to look across those 20 spots, across the 4 different regions, you'll also see that there are 2 companies that have placed in the top 5 in 3 out of the 4 regions. One of them you'll recognize from last year, which is Rolex, which is in 3 out of the top 4, not in Latin America. That's the same challenge that they had last year. And you'll see that the other one is Google, who is in the top 3 in 3 out of the 4. The one they're not in the top 5 in is in EMEA. And again, not a surprise because EMEA has really been at the forefront of a lot of the data privacy related, transparency, ethical behavior issues around technology companies with not only Google, but companies like Facebook and others. So not a surprise that Google didn't make it into the top 5 in EMEA. You'll see that there are a number of other companies that were in the top 5 in at least 2 of these markets. Companies like Sony, like Microsoft, like Lego, and also Samsung. And just a quick note about Samsung. Stephen's going to talk about them in just a few minutes in more detail. But Samsung has been on the rise, and this is saying a lot given that technology companies in general have seen a significant erosion of trust, especially in EMEA and North America, where it just so happens that Samsung is now into the top 5 in the areas where, frankly, North America and EMEA are the least trustworthy around technology companies these days, and Samsung has now made it into the top 5. You'll notice one company didn't make it into the top 5, and that's Apple, who we're going to talk about in just a few minutes, who not only is not in the top 5, but has seen significant reductions in trust, especially in areas like governance, as we'll talk about in just a few minutes. So those are the winners. That's your walk through the reputation world in dimension weights, dimension scores, and dimension winners. Now I'm going to hand it back over to Stephen, who's going to take us through a couple of company spotlights. Stephen, back to you.
Thanks, Brad. Thanks for taking us through that. So let's begin to dissect the RepTrak 100. Let's take a look at 4 different companies and how they fared and really understand what are some of the underlying trends that drove their reputation change. I'm going to just briefly touch on Lego. And Lego is an organization that remains number 2 and relative to what's been holding it there, it's really strength in leadership and transparency and the viewpoint of the contribution that Lego as a company makes to society. Lego is strong in the 3 key dimensions we've identified: products, citizenship, and governance. And really, in the context relative to other organizations, is really the only company that scores very strongly on governance. Certainly relative to citizenship also does especially well.
Hello, I'm Niels B. Christiansen. I'm the CEO of the LEGO Group. Now, reputation is really important to us in the LEGO Group. It is kind of the perception from stakeholders on how we're doing, and not only a measure of our actions. It really shows us how high affinity the parents have for how LEGO can positively impact their children. It proves how the LEGO play experience really adds fun and engagement and learning to it. It also maybe is a good signal that what we're doing for the planet in terms of investing in renewable energy, in terms of investing in sustainable materials really is being recognized. But what we do is, of course, not only to be on the top of a reputation list. It's really, for me and all my colleagues in LEGO, this is really driving the mission forward of inspiring and developing the builders of tomorrow. It's really important for LEGO to be ranked as number 2 in this survey. It's a great honor, it's quite humbling, and it shows that a lot of stakeholders around the globe are recognizing that we're doing the right things. It's an important way for us to be visible and actually attract talent. But most of all, I think it's a recognition of the great work our colleagues are doing every day to inspire and develop children. The strong performance of LEGO in this year's survey is really based on a simple yet ingenious invention, the brick. The brick actually turns 60 years this year, and it's as strong as ever and as relevant as ever. The play experience offered by the brick actually helps children develop and gives them unlimited possibilities for creativity. Now, on top of that, of course, we contribute to the planet in terms of our investments in renewable energy, our investments into sustainable materials. But I think at the end of the day, what we're really bringing to society is the uniqueness and the play experience around the brick. And that's where we have thousands of employees every year working to get that experience and the brick to many more children around the globe.
But what's interesting is LEGO is an example of a company that truly not only lives its purpose, but actually aligns it with the activation of the products and services it sells. LEGO is actually going to become, in 2018, the first company to make plant-based plastic that will be available for purchase. So talk about trying to make the world a better place to live. LEGO is really living that legacy in the things it chooses to sell, and really has prioritized around an initiative that they call Planet Promise, which is really focused on things they can do to have a positive impact on the stakeholders they serve, the society that they impact, and really being viewed as not just a good corporate citizen, but a company that truly lives and breathes its purpose from top to bottom. Looking at Samsung, we touched on this earlier, it was a fast riser and has had phenomenal success in the past 12 months, and really recovering from where it was in 2016, where it was significantly impacted by the sort of phones catching on fire and the whole issues around the Samsung Galaxy S. And a big part of that was driven by increases in citizenship and governance, in transparently and effectively managing the situation. And certainly its products and services have seen significant increases. In fact, what we're looking at here is the differences between where Samsung has increased in measures of reputation relative to where all companies in the RepTrak 100 have decreased. And you can see the areas where it's had the biggest impact, again, come back to products and services, governance and citizenship. Those are areas where Samsung saw the biggest delta and relative change versus where the rest of the marketplace was going. So in a way, you could argue that Samsung bucked the trend. Its reputation was declining globally across many markets and different companies. Samsung has actually been re-emergent in part of the past 12 months. And I think it's fair to say one of the reasons why is not only has Samsung chosen to focus on the things that matter, it effectively handled the product recall and the challenges and the issues it had with the Samsung Galaxy Note 7. It not only publicly apologized, but it was quick to recall, not once, but twice, issues it had with the phones catching on fire, and very quickly shifted to a new generation of product with the Galaxy 8. But also from a standpoint of what it chose to speak about during the Olympics, it didn't just come out and schlock a product message during the Olympics. It actually really imbued not only the spirit of the Olympics, but imbued it as a canvas through which to really show how the products and services it makes truly benefits society and really was an enablement for helping people to overcome both personal challenges and life challenges. So they found a values-based message to really stand out and be unique and different. And as you can see on the triangulation data on the left-hand side of the slide there, the impact in products and services, the alignment with increase in the key measures of good corporate citizenship, and how that also played out with increases in governance, a really compelling story, how linking those three things can yield competitive advantage in the marketplace. And just another company to look at by contrast, as Samsung was going up, Apple was going down. Apple actually dropped 38 spots in the global RT100 and is now ranked 58th in 2018. So what was interesting about Samsung is what caused Samsung to rise was exactly the very thing that caused Apple to fall in the past 12 months. We conduct a spotlight on Apple and sort of drill deeper into the data. First off, to note that Apple dropped 38 spots on the global RT100 and finds itself at number 58 relative to previous years. And interestingly, the things that accelerated that decline were the key drivers we've identified: ethical behavior, transparency, fairness, environmental sustainability, products and services, and perceptions of good value for money. All these things declined, which caused the reputation of Apple to go down. Interestingly, the one metric where Apple strengthened was on financial performance, which in a way actually hurt its reputation, because with increased profits were higher expectations for Apple to do the right thing, and that certainly perhaps accelerated the decline in overall reputation scores for Apple. But of note, if we look at the decline in products and governance and citizenship perceptions, we can begin to explain why. The events of San Bernardino, accusations of tax evasion in Ireland, battery tampering issues, the less than stellar launch of the iPhone X and the almost $1,000 phone. All these things detracted from perceptions of making the world a better place to live, detracted from measures of good ethics, transparency, and social responsibility, and in a way highlighted a sort of less than desirable reputation for Apple relative to lack of transparency overall. In fact, interestingly, with the new metric we added on supported behavior, we found that it's almost 1 in 5 people today state that given an alternative, they would avoid using or purchasing an Apple product today. So perhaps there's a beginning of an undercurrent of people who are perhaps less enamored with Apple, but interesting to look at Apple in contrast to relative to Samsung. And then finally, just a quick spotlight on Microsoft. As noted earlier, Microsoft is back in the top 10, increasing from where it was in 2017 to take the number 10 slot. One of the interesting phenomena around Microsoft is its perceptions around having a positive influence on society and having an appealing leader are very positive. So it's no longer the association with Bill Gates or even the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. It's Microsoft on its own merits, driving increased measures of reputation, increased perceptions around social influence, and the impact of leadership allows Microsoft to outperform both not just the top 10 companies on key metrics like positive influence on society and strong and appealing leader, but also relative to the top 100. And those are really interesting differentiators that actually begins to help Microsoft set itself apart in a very challenging category of technology. And a lot of it can be attributed to Satya Nadella, the indeed leader of Microsoft as it stands today, essentially viewed as a humble, confident, and socially relevant CEO who really is an example of a CEO with conscience and certainly represents a conviction to take a stand on leadership issues. And we've talked about CEO activism in the past and how important it's becoming. I think Satya Nadella is an example of a leader who's really taking a stance on controversial issues, social issues, even willing to take on a political agenda around things related to data security, privacy issues, immigration, even getting embroiled in the DACA conversation. So it shows that how taking a responsible position on society can actually allow companies to be more successful, even when to some degree they're controversial. So as we begin to look to the future and really understand the impact of what we're seeing here in the data, what is it telling you to do as a company? What are some of the key implications and takeaways that you need to be especially mindful of? Well, the data would suggest the world is at a strategic inflection point. The market forces in play are working against any organization's ability to actually enhance reputation. It doesn't mean that they can't, but certainly they need to navigate the situation very carefully and differently. And perhaps there's loss of trust and potential to win back benefit of the doubt becomes a key priority, at least a key imperative for the next 12 to 18 months. A big part of that would require companies to increasingly win over fence sitters that we've identified. So this pool of the 51% of the world who are unsure about most companies, they become a compelling prospect. The opportunity is to help them understand why they should trust you as a company. Secondly, we've seen in the data, increasing the link between the products and services a company sells and its sort of enterprise-wide sense of purpose can yield significant reputation gains, especially tapping into messaging opportunities around product quality, behavioral ethics, the acts of fairness and social responsibility. All those things can begin to create a sense of reputational reassurance in many ways. You can engender and build trust by tapping into those things. But certainly your ability to get the message across can be inhibited. We talked about the white noise. It requires authentic and genuine communication to break through the sort of corporate hyperbole. It's not about necessarily spending more money or going crazy and switching everything into paid-for media or making radical changes, but perhaps it's about finding a more genuine voice of leadership, perhaps elevating the CEO to be the spearhead for this conversation and finding a way to actually propagate the company narrative with a fresh and compelling perspective. Maybe the CEO is partly the answer. It doesn't mean putting CEOs into cheesy brand commercials, but perhaps it might be helping the CEO find their voice and having a conversation beyond earnings reports. And then finally, the potential's there for companies to differentiate. We know reputation can be a trigger point in making that happen. It's a way that companies can economically win. But interestingly, they only pay the dividends of success when they also understand that it's not just about driving shareholder value, it's also about making the world a better place to live. And so those companies that can identify and align with proactive navigation of social issues and tap into the things that matter to humanity and society are going to be the ones that can not only build reputation equity, but when that moment comes, they'd also build enhanced benefit of the doubt because they would be able to better mitigate against risk by not just engendering some good business, but truly driving goodwill and reputational equity in a sort of positive sense. So that about wraps it up for today. We really thank you for your time and appreciate you joining us to learn more about not only what's changing the world of reputation and getting into some of the reasons why. If you want more information from us, please feel free to go to our website at reputationinstitute.com, where you can actually dig a little deeper into the rankings and see how your company's set up. And if you like what you heard today, or if you just want to comment, please feel free to join the conversation at #RepTrak100. Thanks very much.